there's a document called Enuma Elish, which is the creation account in Mesopotamia. Again, to remind you, Mesopotamia is what is now Iraq. We've got Babylonians and Assyrians. We talked a little bit about a map last week. So they also had their story of creation. And this is the context of the biblical creation account. This is jumping ahead, but where did Abraham come from, or Abram? Ur of the Chaldees. Ur, down here. He didn't come from Israel. He came from Mesopotamia. This is a story he would have grown up with, like part of his worldview. Enuma Elish is the first couple of words, and it means when on high. It's kind of the equivalent of, in Genesis chapter 2, starting at verse 4, it says, there had been no shrub, nothing was created yet, and then God moved and created. So that's what's going on here. They have the same kind of structure. Let's say it's from present day, what would be Iraq, and it's written on 7 separate tablets. Again, they wrote in what's called cuneiform. Akkadian is the language, written on clay tablets that were inscribed. We talked about that a little bit last week. And every year at the New Year's Festival, they use this as part of their ritual. Now, the date of its composition we're not sure of. The oldest copies come from the first millennium BC. But it was probably written early in the second millennium BC. Now, this is a copy of a couple of the Akkadian tablets. And for those of you who read Akkadian, I apologize, this is upside down. So don't let it bother you. There's too often in books that people will write in and say, you've got this figure upside down, and I'm impressed that they were able to recognize that. Let me give you a little synopsis of what's going on in this non-biblical creation account. You start off with 2 primeval gods, pre-existent gods. One, the male, is Apsu, which is fresh water, and Tiamat is the salt water gods. And they commingle, and they produce baby gods. Daddy God and mommy God have baby gods. They're still divine. And one of their descendants is named Marduk. He's called the glorious Marduk. By the way, when we were expecting our first child, I kept to bug my mother-in-law. She would say, what are you going to name them? What are you going to name it? And I said something like Marduk or Sennacherib. When they named him Adam, she, nothing else can have good names you can learn from here. And when he was young, he was given the winds as his plaything, if you like, his toy. And all this playing with the wind and other things that baby gods get around to, they disturbed Tiamat, who's the mother god. She got mad, and she decides to kill all the other gods to get some peace and quiet. I know, hopefully, those thoughts have never crossed our mind, but we do say almost anything for peace and quiet. And she's very powerful, and all the other gods are getting worried a bit because they can't stop her. So they call to Marduk to come and help them. So they recognize something special about Marduk. And he agrees to come and be their champion as long as they reward him by making him their boss, the ruler of all the gods. So they say yes, because it's better to be ruled by one of your brothers than to be dead, killed by your mom. So he challenges Tiamat to single combat. So they go out into battle against each other. And she comes at him, this big monster god, and tries to swallow him. And he sends, remember, his plaything is the wind, he sends it into her, and it's kind of like a balloon, blowing her up until she pops and dies. So Marduk wins, There are also some of the other semi-divine beings, minor gods, he captures as well. But what he does, he takes her body, splits her in two, and makes half of her body the sky, and the earth is the rest of her body. And what he does on the earth is he creates Babylon, the city of Babylon, the temple in particular at Babylon, to be the place where the gods will come and visit the earth. And as it happens, Babylon happens to be his city, so it works out well for him. And what he does is he takes Kingu, who is one of her cronies, or general if you like, and he kills him. And he uses his blood mixed with clay to make human beings. Now why does he do that? Because gods have to eat. Somebody has to grow their crops. And so all these junior gods are going out every day, working in the fields, in this heat, in this humidity. It gets even hotter in Iraq. And they have to be out working in it day after day. And they said among themselves, hey, we're gods. What are we doing this for? Let's have somebody else come and do this for us. And so human beings are made as slaves of the gods. They're to provide them with food and drink. And how do they do that? By giving offerings. They offer it at the temple. Some places the temple has, they have what we would call an altar, which in Mesopotamian culture they would say that's the table of the gods. What happens? Ring the dinner bell, gods gather around, have lunch. And the human's purpose is to bring lunch. This is from a carving from this particular period. I don't know if it's big enough for you to see, but here we have who is Marduk over here in human form. He's got wings, which is one of the things that indicates he's a god. And also, I can't remember if we mentioned it last week, we see several places where we have pictures from ancient Near East, and quite often the gods have, their helmet has horns in it. So we know that this is a deity rather than just a human being because he's got horns. And here is what's figured to be Tiamat. And so here is a picture of him fighting her. What he has here is, looks like possibly lightning bolts or something in his hand. It's hard to, if wind is his weapon, it's kind of hard to draw a picture of wind. So, now how does this compare with Genesis 1? How do each of these view the gods? How do you react to the Enuma Elish story? How do they present the gods there? Non-rhetorical question. Okay, we've got male and female. Violent against each other. Maybe not intrinsically violent, not by their nature, but when they get crossed over sometimes relatively inconsequential things. They're mad.
The creation for man was not relational in the sense of a healthy relationship or a kind word. I'm not getting the right word there. But man was created to be a slave.
Yeah, okay, there's a different picture of the relationship between the gods and men. But from our view of Mesopotamian gods, there's not much dignity there. I mean, there's lack of grace, if you like. But what we have in Genesis 1 is a picture of God in control, all-powerful. In fact, I almost see the picture, especially at the beginning part, is almost serene. It talks about the darkness over the face of the earth, and we didn't read that part, but it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the surface of the deep. I don't know, I haven't got up that early in the morning since we moved down here, but driving out very early in the morning and see some farm ponds, for example, and the mist is just kind of moving over there. And that's my picture, limited picture of the Spirit of God that's there. But if you like. This is a biblical view, a serene farm pond. The Mesopotamian view is your hurricane view of power and might and danger. Now, what is the place of creation in each of these stories? The Mesopotamian story is mainly a conflict within the pantheon, between the gods. It's a battle scene. Creation is only an afterthought, a parenthesis that's put there at the very end. It's not integral to the whole story. Well, in Genesis, it's the main interest of Genesis 1. It's the idea of creation moving decently and in order, culminating, if you like, at the apex of the story with the creation of human beings. And I'll just mention in passing, we don't have time to go into this in detail, but this is again parenthesis here, but day 6 is creation of human beings. What is day 7? We haven't talked about day 7. That's the Sabbath. In the Jewish Israelite story, the peak of the story is Sabbath. Taking time to enjoy God's creation, ceasing work and spending time with God. We are not the end of the story. Sabbath is the end of the story. But that whole idea of rest. Here, I don't see any rest. But creation is the whole story in Genesis 1. And what's the relationship between the divine and the creatures? You've already mentioned in Mesopotamia, in those stories, they are at the bottom. They're like the plants and the animals. If you like, I don't think I have this on the slide, but remember where we had God at the top, and in Mesopotamia, everything else would be down here, and there's a big gap between them. But that's a completely different view than what we have in Genesis. There we have image being spoken of, co-regent, co-rulers, co-creators. God is lifted high as creator, but humanity is lifted high as well because they are in his image. In Mesopotamia, the gods are lifted high, and the human beings are just the scum of the earth down here. So it's a completely different picture of who we are. And also, as I say, what's the point of each story? Who or what is being honored? I've kind of answered that for the biblical story. Humanity, of the created beings, humanity is the peak, if you like. But then Sabbath is being ultimately honored. But who's being honored in the Enuma Elish story? Remember his name? Marduk. Some of you are looking for kids' names, I wrote it down. Good. This is a story about the elevation of Marduk and why he's important. Now, a lot of these documents containing Enuma Elish have been found, well, they've been found all over the ancient Near East, but also, where would you expect it was probably first written? I would argue that it was probably first written in Babylon, because this is your story. You want to be the top city because the God, your God, is important there. There were other cities that might have had their own creation stories. We don't know too many different creation stories for Mesopotamia. In Egypt, there are several different creation stories, and each one of them may be highlighting a different city, a different temple, a different god. But I know less about Egyptian than I do about Mesopotamian, so that's why we're looking at this one. But again, we've talked about this already. This is the biblical picture. The Mesopotamian picture puts everything but God clear down there at the bottom. We're going to move on and look at another ancient Near Eastern story while we're here. Any questions on their creation account?
Did they ever address what happened to the father? Marduk was, okay.
No, they don't really talk about that. He's off watching the Super Bowl, doesn't know what's going on. There's another story which we're going to look at its parallel next week, but There's a Babylonian flood story as well, and it's called Gilgamesh. This is the key character in this particular story. I like Marduk better for name. Gilgamesh doesn't ring. Gilgamesh Baker doesn't go as well as Marduk Baker, so you might not want to take note of his name. But anyway, the oldest complete version of Gilgamesh story is from the 7th century BC. But there are a number of older copies, predecessors of this, separate stories that are joined together in the Gilgamesh story from early in the 2nd millennium. So it was around for a long time. It was a popular story. And it was written on 12 clay tablets. We had only 7 with the creation count, but this was written on 12. Here's a copy of part of the 11th tablet, which is our important one. This one's right side up, so you can all read that on this one.
I can read that better.
Yeah, sounds good. You don't have to stand on your head to read that one. It's a bit blurry, though. I apologize. By the way, there are a number of documents from the ancient Near East that throw really interesting light on a lot of things in the Old Testament. We'll be talking about some with historical books, too. But this kind of shows you the importance of them, but the problems of them, too. Because this was at least out to here, and we don't know how long it was. Being clay like this, it's a lot more permanent than if it was written on paper. It was baked, so it's like stone, but if you drop it, you're in trouble. And so there are places where it's lost. And so remember last week we talked about text criticism, getting back to the original biblical text. You're trying to, there might be, I don't know how many copies, there's probably 20 or 30 different copies of variations of the Gilgamesh story. And what you've got to do is find them that fill in these gaps, fill in these blanks. When we look at Samuel, we'll see somewhere along the line the same thing happened to the biblical text, because there's going to be a hole in Samuel. But that's looking ahead. There's the Gilgamesh story. Now what's it about? What's its plot? Now Gilgamesh is an early Babylonian king. We know he was an actual historical figure because one of the things that the kings did in order to win brownie points with the gods was to either build or fix up their temples. And so when you die, you have a list of all your good deeds, and that would include temple building. And we have some Gilgamesh's temple building. But in some ways, he's like King Arthur. We know he was a historical figure in early British history, but he probably, and there might have been a Merlin that was with him, but Merlin probably didn't turn them into fish and have them swim in it. I don't know if you've seen Sword in the Stone. There are legends and stories that have gathered around King Arthur that are probably not historically accurate. Probably the same for him. He was an actual king. And the story is that he befriends a wild man, a beast man that he runs. He likes to hunt, Gilgamesh does. So he goes out there and he runs across Enkidu, who lives out there in the wild. And he says, hey, this is really great. I'm a king. I got to do all this boring stuff. I wish I could be out here with you. And as part of the story, too, he gets to know Enkidu, and he says, let me introduce you to civilization. How do I live? So he comes in, takes him to Babylon, and the first thing he does is introduces him to a prostitute, which is civilization to him. It makes me think, what's American civilization? Wherever you go now, you see McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. These are the high points of American civilization. In some way, it's much like what Gilgamesh introduces Enkidu to. But anyway, Enkidu dies, and that really causes a problem psychologically for Gilgamesh. He says, I'm mortal. Even this guy who lived out there, had all the healthy food, no worries, he dies. I'm going to die too. So how do I give eternal life? So that's the context of the story. And he approaches a fellow named Utnapishtim, who was a human being, but he's achieved immortality. And he said, I've heard of you, we call him Ut for short. How did you become immortal? And so he tells him his story. And his story is found on tablet 11 that we were talking about there. And he tells the story about a god, a different god this time, who seeks to destroy humanity for no apparent reason. We don't know why, in this case, humanity needed to be destroyed. But there was one God, at least, who was on the side of the human beings. And so he warned the human beings what was going to happen. And I think there were 3 different ways that God was going to do it. Possibly a plague, a famine. But the third way that they were going to be destroyed is by a flood. And so the God warns the human beings, and he says, take your reed house and make a boat out of it. And it describes making this boat. It's shaped like a big cube. He caulks it, puts pitch, tar between the reeds. He brings in food. He does all this in 7 days. And then he brings in animals. He brings in his family. And he also brings in artisans and craftsmen, because he knows that the world is going to be destroyed, and I want to at least have a plumber and my car mechanic with me, because I don't know how to do these things when I get off the ark. So he brings those in. And then it says rain comes for 7 days, and it covers everything. The gods themselves are frightened, because it's a huge thunderstorm. The rain stops after 7 days, and the gods in the meantime are starving. Because remember, where do they get their food? They get their food from human beings sacrificing to them. So it's interesting in the story, they all get on this other god that caused this, and they get mad at him. What are you doing this? You're cutting off our food supply. But that's a side issue. And then, I say the ark, it's just called boat there, but it grounds on a mountain called Mount Nitzir. And Utnapishtim wants to know, is it dry enough that I can get out without taking a swim? So he sends out birds to find if there's dry land. He sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. He finds out that the land is dry, so he goes out and he makes sacrifices. As soon as he gets off, he makes an altar and sacrifices. And you've got this interesting picture. It says, the gods gather around like flies. Why? A week, no food. As soon as you smell the barbecue, they're there. But talking about different pictures of the all-powerful God of Israel and the starving gods of Mesopotamia.
So those gods weren't killed in the flood?
No. I'm not. Well, their concept was the gods, in fact, lived in the heavens, in the heavenly, so they weren't bound to the earth. But their food supply was somehow bound to the earth. And so Utnapishtim leads the occupants of the ark out, and the gods are so thankful for lunch that they make him and his wife immortal. Now, Gilgamesh hears this story and he says, look, I can't do that. It's irrepeatable. And Utnapishtim says, yeah, but he says, I have heard that there's a plant at the far edge of the world that gives you eternal life. If you go out and get this plant and eat it, you'll be immortal. And so he goes off and he finds this plant. On his way back, he falls asleep on this island, and there's a well there. And a snake comes up from the well and eats the plant. And you know that snake is immortal because you know it sheds its body periodically, and that explains why they're trying to answer some of these why questions. But anyway, so poor Gilgamesh, he knows the story, he's now mad at the snake, but he knows he's going to die. So that's kind of the story of Gilgamesh and the flood. Now, we haven't studied it yet. We're going to be doing this next week. We're kind of looking ahead. But there are some similarities that might come to mind. You've probably read the biblical flood story before. What are some of the similarities that come to mind in just hearing this brief synopsis of the story?
Was the bird that found the dry land.
Okay, the birds were involved.
They caulked the thing.
They caulked it. That's one thing. Again, we don't have time to go into depth on this, but it does mention caulking. And just in passing, a very interesting thing coming from the word that's used there, a lot of the translations, we'll look at it a bit more detail next week, but they talk about pitch. But where does pitch come from? Trees. This is Mesopotamia. You've seen pictures of Iraq and some fighting that's going on. There's not trees all over the place. I mean, if this was set in Wilmington, pitch we got all over the place. What do they have all over the place in Iraq? The word that is translated here from Akkadian is the word for bitumen, which comes from oil. They've got oil. So bitumen is a minor thing, but it's a better translation than pitch because they don't have pitch. But anyway, they cock it, so thank you.
They put a lot of food aboard.
They put a lot of food aboard.
Brought animals.
They brought animals. He was smarter than Noah, though, because he brought the Encyclopedia Britannica with him, if you like. We brought all these others. So there are differences as well. One of the main differences is their view of the divine. Again, the contentious fighting gods, the starving gods, as against a god who, in the biblical story, with pain in his heart, brings punishment on his people. But there are some amazing similarities. And it was, I think, in the late 1800s that the tablets were found, and somebody was able to translate these Akkadian texts. And so this made the front page of the London Times about these parallels here are amazing. Now, why might there be these similarities? Some would argue that it's just a fluke coincidence, that they're developed completely separately. But again, as I mentioned, Abraham came from Ur. These stories come from this area. I would argue he knew about it. There's probably some borrowing being involved. Some people would say that Babylon borrowed from Israel. That's a bit problematic because the Babylonian stories seem to be earlier than we have in the biblical account. Some would argue that Babylon is the source for all of these things. But another possibility, I think, which bears consideration, there's a common source. According to the biblical understanding, all of humanity is derived from Adam and Eve, but they're also derived from Noah, if you like. We've got Adam and Eve, their children, humanity expands, but then the flood comes and all of a sudden humanity contracts. And so, according to one way of reading the biblical account, that the Mesopotamians and the Israelites are of common stock. And they would have a common heritage, a common history that they would share. And so this would argue that there was, in fact, an event that affected them. We'll talk more detail about the actual flood next week. But I would be more surprised myself if there is a true relationship between Abraham and these people here. I would be more surprised if there wasn't an overlap between their stories. Because they should know something of each other's society. And so I think it's kind of exciting finding some of these similarities. If you like, it gives some extra biblical support to what's going on in the story. They are theologically separate. What would have happened is that Abraham and his story, on theological grounds, we could argue that God was involved in superintending, maintaining that story. While in Mesopotamia, again, the story developed separately. So the fact that there are differences not necessarily be surprising, but the similarity shouldn't be surprising to us as well. And just because somebody points out these similarities shouldn't make us throw away the Bible, saying it's just a Babylonian myth of some kind. We don't have to accept that. Any questions, comments on the ancient Near Eastern background? Again, some of these will come up in our later discussions, but let's not bad. I've also been 2 minutes of when we're supposed to finish. Only one quarter of it we didn't quite get to. Any other questions on the
What's
ancient
the relationship between Mount Ararat and the other grounding of it?
Okay, Mount Nitzir is up somewhere up here in the north of Israel, or of Assyria. Now it talks about, we usually translated Mount Ararat, but the actual Hebrew says the mountains of Ararat. On this map, there's a place, it's called Urartu, which we call Ararat, which is this region here. So it doesn't, there's not a Mount Ararat, but again, with some folks, they're spending big bucks. They're doing it less now because ISIS seems to like this particular area here. But there've been excavations trying to find it.
And one of these
But
days
both
we'll
put-
find them both at the same place.
No. Well, we could find it there, but I'm not, for me, my faith is not going to be made or fallen if we find it or not, because after all, we take the biblical account, we take the Mesopotamian account, one talks about reeds, the other talks about wood. The chance of it surviving that many years is going to be slim. But again, some of these will come up again later, but that's a good question. I wish we could spend again the whole 8 weeks on just Genesis 1 to 11. Any other questions? Thank you for your patience.